Do you have any suggestion?
No.
Sometimes people get
Yeah. But for me, 1 year it was nice. In fact, that's the year I went. First time that you were nice, we were verified also. Second year I came here to Bombay, but we were housed inside the university, not in the school.
training school hostel.
Huh?
Training school hostel.
And classes would happen inside the university, go through security each time.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to another session of Asset Lectures. Hope I'm audible. Yes. Yeah. So we are here and very privileged to have a very prominent science fiction writer, Mr. Bhatia, here with us. I now request Professor to give a small introduction to the speaker, and then we will hear from the lecture.
Welcome, everyone. Delighted to have Dr. Gautam Bhatia visit us for delivering the asset colloquium. Happened to be a strange coincidence. I met Gautam last month when he was touring the country for the release of his new book. So happened to know that he was going to be again in Bombay for Kala Festival, and that's how this talk materialized. So Gautam is a distinguished constitutional lawyer and a renowned speculative fiction writer from India. He's currently professor of law at the Jindal Global Law School and a leading scholar in constitutional law. Bhatia completed his BA LLB from the National Law School of Indian University, followed by an LLM from Yale University, and specializing in constitutional law. He later earned a PhD from the University of Oxford, where he defended his thesis on constitutional law titled Horizontal Rights and Institutional Approach. He's authored several influential books on constitutional law. Beyond academia, he's a prolific public intellectual, regularly contributing columns to leading Indian media outlets. He also writes and edits analysis of constitutional law and Supreme Court of India on the Indian Constitutional Law and Philosophy blog. However, today, Gautam joins us in a different capacity as a science fiction writer, editor, and critic. He is the coordinating editor of Strange Horizons, a weekly speculative science fiction magazine, and the author of the science fiction duology, The Wall and the Horizon, published by HarperCollins. Both novels featured on Locus Magazine's year-end recommended reading list, and The Wall was shortlisted for the Valley of Awards Award for English language fiction. His latest novel, The Sentence, explores the intersection of science fiction and the ethics of crime and punishment, particularly the death penalty. It's a powerful reflection on justice, identity, and the societal cost of maintaining order. We are honored to have Gautam Bhatia amongst us today and look forward to his talk, The Science in Contemporary Global and Indian Science Fiction.
These are dislodged. Yeah, to stand there and do it, or okay. Okay. A chair might be actually good. Yeah, I just have my notes here. So it's okay. Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation, and it's great to be here. I am not a scientist, but my dad's a mathematician, and so I know all about TIFR and its history, and it's wonderful to be here. So I mean, the topic that I'm talking about is the science in science fiction, and there were two reasons why I framed it this way. One, of course, is that this is an audience of scientists, and so when you come to science fiction, when you read science fiction, obviously you bring to it the sensibility of a scientist. So just to perhaps talk a bit about that, the ways in which science fiction uses science. And the second is that many people who are not closely acquainted with science fiction have a very specific idea of what they think is science fiction, which is normally spaceships and lasers, and things of that kind. So, a certain kind of Star Wars imagination of science fiction. And the genre is much beyond that. And just the word science in science fiction means a lot more than that. So that's the second thing to perhaps just flag at the outset. So I mean, but to begin with this coming to science fiction as scientists. So a lot of what you will see in the classic as well as the contemporary texts of science fiction often will not really hold up from a scientific perspective or a scientific point of view. The example that I can always think of in this context is faster than light space travel, or the ability to travel across the galaxy or a galaxy in very little time. And so that is obviously something that is not possible according to the laws of physics as we know them. And so many of the classic novels have a get out of jail free card, or basically hand waving, where they either assume that the problem of faster than light space travel has been solved, or they will invent concepts that are basically fantasy. So something like hyperspace, Isaac Asimov has that, Star Wars has that, or wormholes that you enter into at one point in the galaxy and you exit at a different point. Often you explain the existence of these concepts by saying, okay, there was a much more advanced civilization that's maybe after I've finished, I can just hold it for now, and then once we can have a Q&A. And so, or you have these explanatory devices. So you say, okay, there was a civilization that was much more advanced than humanity, and they discovered faster than light travel, or they placed these wormholes, they invented hyperspace, and so on. And in fact, it's funny, it's interesting. There is one of the prominent science fiction writers of today is a man called Alistair Reynolds, who used to be an astrophysicist before he became a science fiction writer. And what annoys him the most is science fiction novels where this happens. So in his science fiction novels, you will always have rigorous adherence to the laws of the universe in terms of travel. So he'll always set his novels in space, but either within a distance where you can still cover that distance in reasonable time, or through generation ships where the travel time is takes place across many generations. So basically, I mean, these are more novels which you can perhaps talk about as adventures in space, and perhaps not so much as science fiction, at least as that part of the component goes. So yeah, that's one example of the way science fiction often sidesteps the science to tell a story. And of course, you have science fiction novels that are in the realm of pure speculation. Here, the classic example is what we call first contact stories, which involve the first time that a human being or the human species comes into contact with an alien species. So in that sense, what they might look like, what their bodies might be based on, how they may interact, what their language might be. This is all speculation. It's not really grounded in our science. Otherwise, they would not be aliens, right? And if you think of the very famous film Arrival, which was based on Ted Chiang's famous story, The Story of Your Life, that's an example of again science fiction that is in this context, delving into the realm of speculation. But what these novels or these stories do then is that they use this ability to sidestep the science or to invoke science, but in a more fantastical setting, in order to shed light upon the human condition, right? So if you look at again one of the most famous examples of science fiction is Isaac Asimov's Foundation series, right? So that traces the fall of or decline of a galactic empire over 1,000 years, and what happens when something like that takes place. And Asimov also invents a science called psychohistory, which is the ability to predict future events by studying the behavior of people in large groups. So while an individual's behavior is unpredictable, you can't really tell what that individual might do in the future. Asimov posits that if you were able to study how individuals behave in big groups, that has a degree of predictability, it can become a science. And so the protagonist initially in Foundation is a scientist who invents this field called psychohistory. And he uses psychohistory to predict the fall of the empire and what can be done to preserve the knowledge of the human race in that process. And then that is the trigger for the story to begin. But the story isn't really about the science of psychohistory. You don't really have a detailed investigation into what that science might be, but you establish it as a science, and then you use that to engage as the best novels do about humanity, ambition, greed, pride, all those qualities, and tell that story with the science just existing there, as a backdrop. Another interesting example is again a classic writer and novel, Ursula Le Guin, who wrote a book called The Dispossessed, where the protagonist actually is a physicist, Shevek, and he is searching for what is essentially a variant of the grand unified theory, and he spends time doing that. And he brings to social problems, of course, that perspective. And there's a lot about rivalries between scientists, the conditions under which scientific work takes place, the incentives for science to happen, is all of that. But obviously, you don't really have a description or an account of this grand unified theory or the grand temporal theory in that book. You don't really have that. But the science becomes a basis for then discussing other things. In this book, there is a fully functional society of anarchists. So they have managed, and he is one of them, and they have managed to establish, non-hierarchical, equal society with its flaws and problems. And the book is an exploration of how that happens and what happens when a person from that society comes into contact with a more traditional capitalist society, a society that is recognizable to us. The other, again, hand-wavy thing that she invents is something called the Ansible, which allows you to communicate over vast distances in space with no time lag. So she does not do space travel or faster than light space travel, but communication can take place, at that speeds, and then she uses that to establish the background within which the story takes place. There are also explorations of the limits of gender. So in Ursula Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness, a different novel, also a classic, there is a planet where people can voluntarily, they are not of either gender, but every month, they can be of either, and that's so they are basically hermaphroditic, and their genders change potentially, every month, and then the society is based on that kind of a structure, right? And then she explores what might it look like, what might a world look like where there was where gender wasn't a fixed trait, where gender was malleable in this way. Of course, today's world that is more of a reality than it was in her time. But in that sense, that's where she goes. These last three examples, Asimov's Foundation, Le Guin's, Ansible, and the grand temporal theory, and exploring gender, also illuminates the fact that when we talk about the science in science fiction, it's not just the physical sciences. It's not just physics, chemistry, mathematics. These play a very important role in science fiction, but science also involves social science. So you look at the way societies organize themselves. You look at alternatives to what we are ingrained to think of as social organization, and so on. Right. So the science there means a lot more than what we think of narrowly as science or what physical scientists do. So that is, in a sense, an overview of the different ways in which science fiction can engage with science. I want to then now come to a couple of concrete examples in which that engagement then is at a much deeper level, where the science actually plays a significant role in the story. So it's not just a backdrop, it's not just a prop, it's not just a device to throw light on the human condition, but is actually integral to the story. There are some classics where that happens. So, for example, Larry Niven's Ringworld is a novel where you have a planet in the shape of a ring, and a lot of it is actually the science of how that would work. How the ring-shaped planet works. So you have examples from the classic science fiction. But I want to talk about a more contemporary set of works that are perhaps more accessible, are better written, and so on. So one of my favorite novels is a recently published novel called The Mountain in the Sea by a writer called Nayler. It came out 2 years ago and was a finalist for the Arthur C. Clarke Award for Science Fiction. And The Mountain in the Sea is a very interesting novel of first contact, but a different kind of a first contact novel. It takes place entirely on Earth. It takes place in the near future world where, of course, climate change is a big issue, is a big problem. And you have various things happening, around that. But the premise of the novel is that because of human activity and intensified human activity on the seabed, there has been an accelerated process of evolution on the seabed, under the sea, which is actually, that can happen. And because of that accelerated process of evolution on the seabed and underwater, there has come to exist a race of broadly sentient and intelligent octopi. Right? So they have gained a certain kind of sentience and intelligence. And the novel is about basically first contact, or the interaction between human beings, in this case, an environmentalist, a naturalist, and this octopus species. Now, what role does the science play here? Now, there is a lot of research into octopus behavior and octopus neurology and octopus, the life. A very interesting book which is publicly accessible, it's not arcane, is a book called Other Minds by Peter Godfrey Smith. Okay. Yeah, should I use the chalk? Okay. So, right. Okay. So right. Okay. So I'll write some of them later, the ones I mentioned earlier. But right now, the novel is called the Mountain in the sea, and the author is Ray Nayler. And the book about octopi is called Other Minds. By Peter Godfrey Smith. Yeah. So yeah, so there is a lot of research around the life cycle of octopi, and there are a few things that that are well known. So one, for example, is that octopi communicate through language of color. So they have chromatophores on their skin, and of course, it's communication at a very, very basic level, not words and languages, but their communication takes place through the color of their skin, through chromatophores, through how they change shades of their skin and so on. That's how they use to send messages about like danger, food, stuff like that, right? So one is that's one piece of research that's well known. The other is that they have a distributed nervous system. So in the octopus, it's not like a centralized nervous system, brain nervous system that that human beings have, but it is actually dispersed. Each octopus arm has a degree of autonomy. Not complete autonomy, but a degree of autonomy that is based on the way that their neurons are sort of distributed across their whole body. So it's a more decentralized brain and nervous system. That's also something that's known about octopi. And the third is sociability. So they are often social animals, and there are entire octopus settlements that are there, in Australia under the sea, and so there is study of how they behave in groups, right? So these are all facts or scientific facts that we know about octopi from study from the science about them. And so what the book does is that it basically takes these known facts and extrapolates them, into a context where now, okay, given all these facts about octopus behavior, what would it be like if they were actually fully intelligent or fully sentient as we are? And so in the book, then you have the development of a complete octopus language of color, right? So it's now not just the communication of basic things like food, danger, and so on, predator, prey, but actually they invent an entire language that is based on color. So it's based completely on the fact that octopi communicate through chromatophores and color changes, but skin color changes, but it extrapolates to a context where they're more intelligent, right? Similarly, he does something similar with the fact that, okay, if your nervous system is distributed, decentralized, if your brain is decentralized, then the way you organize your society, would probably also be more towards decentralization and would look more decentralized than, say, an ordinary human society, a human settlement. So he uses that to then explore what might an octopus, grouping look like, how might they organize society, and how might they actually to do that. And at all times he operates under constraints. It's not like you have this complete fantasy about how they will act, but the human beings themselves are trying to communicate with the octopi. So the book is written from a human perspective, right? So the limitations under which we would operate, the epistemic limitations under which we would operate, when we try and communicate with this new species, are rigorously adhered to. So it's not that you are given a full slice of octopus world building, but you're given these glimpses of how they might communicate, of how they might organize themselves, which takes a route from science, and then it goes a little forward, is extrapolated to a different context. So I think that for me, that is a really interesting example of a contemporary science fiction novel that really deeply engages with science, where science, in this case biology, is actually a fundamental building block of how the story operates, right? So the story, proceeds through these scientific, ideas and what it might look like in a different context. So I would recommend that book. It's a very good example of contemporary science fiction that puts the science, in science fiction. There are other examples of novels that do similar things, although I think none as well as this one, but there are other examples of novels that do that. So, for example, there is, again, a very popular novel called Children of Time. By this writer called Adrian Tchaikovsky. Who was actually a zoologist before he became a science fiction writer, and that shows. So in his novel, again, the premise is something similar, except that it's not octopi, it's spiders. So there is, I mean, the premise is that there is a planet, and again, so the human beings are bombarding it with certain materials to accelerate the evolution of what they think are actually, other kinds of species. But what happens is that you end up having, a race of highly evolved spiders. And then the novel takes place on the planet where they gradually build a society. And again, it's not that they're talking. It's not like you have like spider, English, or like spiders like chatting. It's completely non-verbal, obviously. But it's about how they end up, building society. What it looks like, how it would look like. It's of course arboreal. So among the trees, what materials they would use to do that, and so on. And again, taking what we know about spiders. Taking what we know about their behavior from real life, it then extrapolates to what society might look like of intelligent spiders. Also, very interesting interlude where the human experiment of bombarding the planet with that material has also led to ants becoming intelligent. So you have one chapter where there is a conflict between the spider colony and the ant colony, and the ants have become also evolved. And there, so in science fiction, you have a very standard trope of the hive mind, right? So you have, species that act in terms of like a hive. So they act with like one centralized directing, intelligence, and then the entire colony acts together. So knowing the behavior of ants in terms of, the hive behavior, he then extrapolates that into a context where how would intelligent ants in a hive behave, right? So you can still relate it back to the science of how ants act in our world, but of course in a very different setting and context. So I think this is one set of modern science fiction novels that take a very interesting approach towards science, and they're both biology, they're both lives of non-human animals, and ask themselves, okay, like given what we know about these animals and the way they behave and act, if they were to evolve much further, what would that look like? Keeping in mind all the constraints of of science writing, right? So it could just be speculative science writing, except it's set in a story, a novel, right? So that's one set of works that I think do this in this fashion. Another set of recent novels are engaged with scientific issues and scientific problems, but they look at more the economics of it and other things around that. The most interesting, or the most prominent example is climate change. So there is an entire genre of science fiction writing which is called climate fiction, because it engages with climate change in different ways and in different dimensions. You would probably know the name of Kim Stanley Robinson, who is one of the most famous writers writing in the genre, and his most recent book, The Ministry for the Future, actually deals with that. But the book actually I want to talk about is actually, I think for me, a really interesting and at times funny book. Is a book that won the Arthur Clarke Award last year. It's got a very funny name. The book is called Venomous Lumpsucker. The author's name I've forgotten right now, but and Venomous Lumpsucker is a species in the book. It's a species of fish. So the book is called Venomous Lumpsucker. And so the premise of Venomous Lumpsucker is that you have this like climate change is obviously driving species to extinction, right? And more species are becoming extinct. So what do you do, and how do you respond? And in this book, the bleak answer is that capitalism responds as it will, which is that just like in the case of climate emissions and the climate crisis, instead of actually solving the problem and actually addressing the issue of what is causing the emissions and what is and stopping that, you try for a market-based solution, which is carbon credits, right? So you pay to pollute, right? So you pay, and the idea is that that, economic costs will over time lead to, the most efficient person polluting and the rest not. So that, of course, we know that doesn't solve the problem. So in Venomous Lumpsucker, that solution is transferred to the extinction domain. So basically, instead of carbon credits, you have what they call extinction credits. So corporations that really want to drill or like mine or do something in an area where there is an endangered species now are no longer having to be bound by laws, but can buy credits, and then that gives them the right to make a species extinct if the price is right, if they can pay enough for that for enough credits, right? So that is, and the idea being that then you will put that money into conservation efforts, right? So if you're efficient enough to do this work, then you have the right to make a species extinct, and that money will then go into conserving other kinds of species, right? And one of the species at risk is the venomous lumpsucker. And this is like a really like, it's a dark humor, very bleak, but it tells you a lot about, both, of course, the modern climate crisis and also the limitations of science in solving the problem, because we all know the scientific answer. We all know what the science requires. But here, science is overridden by economics, by other powerful actors, and so on. And the other interesting issue that a lot of modern science fiction explores in a similar context is that of terraforming. Terraforming basically means making an otherwise uninhabitable planet or piece of land inhabitable over time. So there's often this idea that, okay, if the Earth becomes uninhabitable over time, then we can go to the moon or to Mars. And although Mars and Elon Musk, he may have talked about this at some point. You may not want to listen to him, but this is something that is a pet project of his. You can go to Mars or to the moon, and you can terraform it. You can bombard the surface with rays, raise the temperature of the ground, and make it fit for human habitation over like an accelerated period of time, and have then have humanity live over there. The issue there is obviously that in a certain sense, this is presenting a depoliticized technocratic answer to what is a political problem, which is the fate of our planet, our home planet, right? And in that sense, the attempt is to depoliticize science by trying to act as if these are non-political choices. And a lot of good modern science fiction addresses that. So, of course, Kim Stanley Robinson does that. So, there is a novel called 2312, about the year 2312, where terraforming plays a big role. The recent novel, which again was a Clarke Award finalist last year, is called Pluto Shine, which explores the possibility of terraforming Pluto, and what happens when you do that, and many of the problems associated with that. And another novel called The Terraformers, where the premise is that actually corporations can adopt certain planets, and in return for corporate breaks, can then offer to terraform that planet. And so you have this whole idea of, okay, is it possible for terraforming as an aspect of CSR, right? So can that happen at a planetary scale? So in that sense, you have like these issues of science intersecting with politics and economics, and in different interesting ways that take place in these books. So that is just like sort of a broad overview of the ways in which science enters modern science fiction. I've done half an hour, so what I'll do is, since I want to leave some time for discussion, to do a quick perhaps run through of contemporary Indian science fiction and what's being written in the field, since that was part of this talk. So Indian science fiction, there is of course a long tradition of Indian science fiction in various languages. So in Bengali, as far back as 1850s, you had a distinct genre called Kalp Vigyan, which obviously you can translate that. And that was Bengali science fiction that's been around for a very long time. And in modern days, you have, Kalpa Biswa, anthology of Bengali science fiction, magazine, and so on. Marathi, there was a tradition, and Tamil as well. English language Indian science fiction, we know of Jayant Narlikar as one of the pioneers of that. So again, very, very focused on the science of it, which is, which fits with his other roles. But of late, the last 5 or 6 years, there has been, a rise of modern Indian science fiction written in English. A lot of it involves near future dystopias. So near future, dystopias within India. So for example, in 2016, Anil Menon wrote a novel called Half of What I Say, which, among other things, explored the possibility of what an Aadhaar-like surveillance system would do when combined with cheap, almost free internet across the country, right? So quite prescient in many ways. Near future dystopia there. Recently, this year, last year actually, last January, a novel called Idolatry was published by Adit Sudarshan. I'll just write that again. And that again takes the Indian fascination with religion to a science fictional context, where basically they've invented this. Everybody can get a personal virtual god, who will study their behavior, who will study like their behavioral patterns, and will then be able to give them like tailored prayers, and tailored like answers to their prayers, which is, yeah, when you think of it, it's quite dystopic in many ways, and it's set in a near future Bombay, so a near future Bombay where this is happening now. Every person has their own personal god that they can pray to and get answers to their prayers based on their study of their behaviors. We have a lot of modern Indian science fiction that engages with climate change. So that is, you'll see it some in various anthologies of science fiction. But the most recent example of that is a collection of short stories called Biopeculiar by Gigi Ganguly, which again came out earlier in 2024, which is basically a very interesting set of stories that straddles the boundary between science fiction and magical realism. So, and it takes various non-human points of view, so what might be the perspective of a cloud, or of an animal, so it takes those perspectives and then tries to look at how these, creatures or even non-living beings would respond to the problem of climate change. So there is that kind of writing as well. And then of course you have classic science fiction that engages with some of those classic themes. Recently, Lavanya Lakshminarayan's Interstellar Mega Chef, a book that came out last year, does that. It's like, it deals with what if you were to take baking shows, in our world, with all their problems of, appropriating culture, appropriating cuisine, issues of power, and then had that done in space, in a galactic empire context. What would that look like? So a cooking contest in space in an empire, think of it that way. So yeah, there's some interesting things with that. And then of course there's my work as well. Most recently, I wrote a novel called The Sentence, where I take one of those, again, classic science fictional trope of cryogenic preservation, right? You preserve somebody's body in cryosleep and can then, resurrect them. Of course, it's not yet possible in our world, but it's something that science fiction has been using for a very long time, often in the context of space travel, long space travel. So I use that in the context of crime and punishment. So if it's of death penalty, you were able to use this as a punishment, with the option of then resurrecting a criminal if it was found later on that they were actually innocent and they were not a criminal. Would you want to use that punishment, as a way of replacing capital punishment and using that? And so I play around with those themes a bit. So the intersection of science fiction and crime, punishment, law, and so on. So that's a brief look at where the genre is at the moment. Yeah, so it's 4:40, I think got 20 minutes roughly for discussion. So yeah, open to any questions and conversation that people might be interested in having based on this discussion. Yeah. Yeah, this is a big debate. This is a big debate among science fiction critics and writers. When did the genre begin? And yeah, there's a lot of different answers. The most common answer is that modern SF begins with Frankenstein. So Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is the first modern science fiction novel, and as you can see, it has all the themes that you would expect from science fiction. So technology, the promises and the perils of technology. What does it mean to be human? Non-human consciousness, all of that. Yeah. So normally people normally agree that Frankenstein is the first modern English language science fiction novel. That came later. H.G. Wells, Jules Verne, they all came a few decades after Frankenstein. Yeah. So there was the next generation was after that. Yeah.
It's going to be more interactive. So if you are closer by, it will be easier for people to hear you.
There was a novel in French about the resurrection.
Right.
It's called The Man with the Broken Ear.
Okay. Yeah. Right.
Idea of resurrection after feeling for them.
Right.
Yeah, no, thanks for that survey. So I guess what I was wanting to understand was, you gave us a very nice overview of a number of, trends in this broad area. But I want to understand where the boundaries are. I mean, I was sort of triggered by your saying that, there are these science fiction novels which postulate faster than light travel and things like that, which, irritate certain people because it's not scientific. But then one could make a similar statement about Isaac Asimov's psychohistory that, doesn't sound plausible at all, for example. That was, a step too far. And, there's some boundary between science fiction, fantasy, this futuristic dystopia. I mean, there's no sharp boundary between all of these. So I was just wanting to know where is it, what is the boundary that you are sort of calling science fiction? And having done that, I was just curious whether you thought there was some particular value, I don't know whether that's the right word to use, whether that genre is bringing something different, unique, and so on and so forth. Because one of the things you did say is that Isaac Asimov, after doing all this, the point of that was that he explored human nature. So are these all just ways of sort of, bringing out things about our own selves and our own society, or is there something else that you think these books are doing?
Yeah, I mean, so the lines are always blurred and always on a debate, right? So in fact, that's why these days people often prefer the term speculative fiction, right? So not science fiction, not fantasy, but speculative fiction, right? So it's a more umbrella term that incorporates, both traditions and in the 2000s you had briefly something called slipstream, which was neither quite science fiction nor quite fantasy, somewhere in the middle, right? So I think that there's no real way to to draw these lines, but there are of course certain, so Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit are very clearly fantasy. So there's no question that is fantasy. And similarly, Arthur Clarke's 2001: Space Odyssey or Rama are very clearly science fiction. Like so, you have like exemplars of both, and you wouldn't normally put Tolkien and Clarke in the same conversation, and they're doing different things. So I think that in that way, there is some degree of use in trying to have some kind of boundary and saying, okay, look, there is an element of science in these books. It may be extrapolated, it may be implausible, but it is recognizably science. So, and people are doing what we would understand and recognize as science, or the basis of certain actions of the world is science. It's not just magic, right? So there is an explanation for it. It may not be an explanation that makes sense or is plausible, but there is an explanation for it. Whereas in fantasy, it's just magic, right? So there is no explanation. So I think that might be a way of drawing that distinction, because psychohistory, yeah, implausible, yes, but there is an explanation of why and how it works. You're not predicting future action just by virtue of being a wizard or a sage who just knows. You're predicting it using methods that are explainable, even though they might not make sense. So I think that's one thing. Secondly, yeah, what use are these? Yeah, I mean, I think again, like any good writing, yeah. Yeah. No, I get you, right? So I think that for me, at least, the reason why this genre interests me and why I write in it is that I think like what you can do here is that you can change like one or two things about the world that we know, and take for granted. You can change them and then ask what if. So again, one of my favorite stories is Asimov's Nightfall. It's a story where you have a planet surrounded by 6 suns. So it has 6 suns, and so at any given time, at least one sun is in the sky. So there's never nightfall, except in 2000 years once, when all 6 suns are on the other side of the hemisphere, and then night falls and stars come, and this is a society that has never seen stars, that doesn't know what stars are, and for 2000 years has never seen them. And how would society react if that happened, right? So what if you never had known what night was, and then suddenly it was night, right? So what would you do? And that, I think, tells us about ourselves, right? So I think, like, for me, yeah, this genre is interesting because it can do that. It can just change this one thing, these two things, and say, okay, now think how would we as a species react, right? And that really, I think, is very interesting to do, and to read and to write and all of that. Yeah.
Have there been anyone that has been proscribed?
Sorry?
In the history of science fiction, do you recall anything that was proscribed?
Books that were banned.
Yeah.
I mean, many books. I mean, I don't know exactly, because Soviet writers, right, frequently had their books banned. So one of the most famous, in fact, yeah. Actually, now I remember the first ever book that the Soviet Union banned was a science fiction novel. It was called V by Yevgeny Zamyatin, which was a critique of the Soviet state. And so in 1923 they banned it, so, or 21 something. But basically the first book they banned was science fiction novels, Soviet Union, right? In the 60s and 70s, the Strugatsky brothers, whom you may know because the Tarkovsky movie Stalker is based on a Strugatsky brothers novel called Roadside Picnic. Their novels, they couldn't, like, they had to do it through samizdat, through like passing around chapter by chapter in private homes. They couldn't publish for a while. Yeah, so I mean, frequently books have been banned, and science fiction is a novel of ideas, often is dangerous in that way. So there are good reasons why you may want to ban science fiction.
Yeah, it's good to know. I thought science fiction writers were less persecuted.
Hi.
Yeah.
I just wanted to know if there are certain trends that go on in writing, like with certain COVID-19. Is there a rise of dystopian universes with viruses being around, or something like that? Some trends that you've seen in science fiction, and how?
Yeah, so COVID-19 not so much, because I think people don't want to read about pandemics after having lived through one. But I have read a couple of books that were pre-19 and had pandemics, the pre-COVID-19, and they featured pandemics. But no, so yeah, so I mean, there have been trends throughout the history of science fiction. We have the golden age, which was 1940 to 50, where you were exploring, other planets, space travel, so on. Then there was what they call new wave in the 60s, which sort of, explored gender, sexuality, things of that kind. Then you had cyberpunk with William Gibson's Neuromancer in the 80s, which looked at the internet revolution, computers, that became a big thing. And now you have various subgenres. So you have, for example, something called solar punk, which is more to do with utopian science fiction, right? So how would we build utopia, and how would we construct utopia in a world of climate change and wars and so on? So there is there is solar punk that specifically looks at the mechanics of creating sustainable, worlds, utopias, and so on. Dystopia has always been a popular motif, so that happens quite a bit. But yeah, I think for a while, space opera was out of fashion. There's these expansive, books where you have like space travel over and the sense of space and time, expanding. It's making a bit of a comeback now. So yeah, so it's always changing. Trends are always changing, and at any given time, things can be quite quite different. But yeah, but no COVID novels. I haven't come across them. I think people don't want to read them. So yeah.
Any AI related science fiction
Well, so
coming up?
science fiction has been dealing with AI for a very, very long time, right? From Asimov's robot series, right? So sentient, intelligent, like robots, and like that's been going on for the last 60, 70 years now. There's nothing new. It's always been the case that SF has dealt with that. Yeah.
Had examples of speculative fiction from earlier times that perhaps was attempting to speculate the time we live now? And do you have examples of things that are not far into the future for us, but perhaps earlier novels that were speculating on what the world we live now would be like, and so on?
Yeah, but I mean, I think the more or less, so I mean, you have, again, Neuromancer is a good example, right? William Gibson's book, Cyberpunk, which it basically predicts the internet a few years before the internet, right? So it basically invented the term cyberspace. That came from that book. So I think you have examples of books. There's, I think, Back to the Future set around this time, 2020 or thereabouts. There's that really interesting line in Star Trek, which talked about the 2024 Irish reunification, which didn't happen finally, but people were waiting for it this year. They kept quoting that meme, hoping it would happen. But yeah, I think normally you have, I think, books set little in the future, not so much books set around the present time. I haven't come across too many of those. Yeah.
I think there's a character in Asimov or Clarke novel, I forget it, who's described as wearing spectacles out of affectation.
Oh, right.
But of course, surgery came to all.
Yeah. I can't remember. Could be either. Yeah.
So this is in companion to Arkadev's question. Like, while it might be true that science fiction writers are not arrested as frequently as this one, but so whatever reason, science fiction or speculative fiction writers are not considered in the same genre as literary fiction. And so, for instance, this is something we discussed before. Ishiguro, even though he did science fiction, he's not considered. He will not be classified because that is sort of less. So, what's your take on this, and how has this changed over the recent times?
Yeah, this is an industry, issue, right? Marketing issue, publishing issue. Like I was telling you earlier, Shehan Karunatilaka's The Seven Moons of Mali Almeida, which won the Booker Prize 2 years ago. If you read the novel and you weren't told that it had a genre label or not, you would say this is spec fic. This is all the tropes of spec fic. But it wouldn't have won the Booker Prize if it did. So it was marketed as a novel, a literary fiction novel. And he himself has denied it being spec fic because he knows that it will then affect his reputation as a serious novelist, right? So I think it's been a problem where science fiction is not thought to be the serious kind of writing, and in part it's, I think, self-inflicted, because I think there was a time in the 60s where science fiction writers very consciously eschewed literary style, and they were like, we have ideas, we need us for our ideas. So Asimov, for example, right, like the ideas are all there, but his writing is just not good. Like it's turgid. Like the prose is really hard. It's just not good writing. That has now changed. I mean, you can't get away with that anymore. Like you wouldn't get published now if your writing was bad. Well, you can, but it's hard. Your USP can't be I have good writing and I have good ideas and bad writing, right? So I think it's changed. I think like for many reasons. SF's beginnings were in pulp, right? So in 1930s, pulp magazines were where you would publish science fiction. So there's a long history of it being taken not as seriously as literary fiction. It is changing. There are breakthroughs. Ursula Le Guin is, a writer who is respected, across the board. So it is changing, but I think still change is slow, which is why, Ishiguro, who has written a science fiction novel, two science fiction novels, Clara and the Sun and Never Let Me Go, and a fantasy novel, The Buried Giant, is not thought of as a genre novelist. And Shehan Talika denies writing genre. You still have those issues, but I think it is changing. Amitabh Ghosh, of course, Calcutta Chromosome, his first novel was science fiction. Yeah, so you have that. I think it is changing, but slowly.
Yeah, sure. Um, so thinking of science fiction in the sense of fiction about doing science, are there any interesting examples of sort of maybe short stories or something, sort of a slice of life thing about just how scientists do science? Are there novels or short stories, like
Yes.
not speculative, not just
Yeah, so this one, Le Guin's Dispossessed, which I talked about, has a lot of like these rivalries between scientists, and stealing ideas, and insecurities, and all of that, and not passing on your paper to like the institute because all of that. Yeah, so it has all of that very much so. The protagonist is a physicist, there's a lot of that going on there. So you may find it interesting. So there is that, and the three-body problem, the famous three-body problem that came out 10 years ago, 16 Liu. Again, a lot of it is the setting is like a science lab and a science institute. So yeah, there are a couple of examples where that happens.
but just before I pass on the mic to Ram Prasad, okay, I don't know if anybody knows about Power Rangers Space Patrol Delta. I don't think it qualifies much as great science fiction, but it was set in 2025.
Okay. So there are science fictions which are very strong extrapolation towards the absolute edge.
Yeah.
So like soft science fictions, for example, Hyperion Cantos and all that.
Sorry?
Hyperion Cantos, yeah.
Yeah.
So do you have any such suggestion which falls on the on similar genre? That sort of,
Which specifically what? Like,
as in like soft science fiction and space operas, which sort of drag the scientific explanation to an extreme end.
oh yeah,
where
okay,
you
yeah,
can
yeah.
disconnect
No, in fact,
from-
yeah, my favorite writer, I mentioned him, Alistair Reynolds. Like he is, I think, the master at that. If you read his, I'll just write out the name. Yeah. Yeah. So Alistair Reynolds, I think, is the best person working in that domain right now. And he has the Revenant, Revelation Space series, and my favorite novel, The House of Suns. Yeah, like it is. Yeah, House of Suns is interesting. It's basically the premise is that there are there is this person, and she basically, or there are this a group of people who divide themselves into 100 or 1,000 like clones, and then send the clones down to explore the galaxy. And every once in 20,000 years, they have a reunion. The lines have a reunion, and so by the end of by the time the book is book setting, these lines have lived 6 million years. Not, of course, not all the time when conscious, because that obviously then you die, but in like preservation and so on. So they basically lived 6 million years, and they've seen like entire space empires rise, fall, like thrive, flourish, fail. And yeah, this sense of like space and time that's just like taken to its absolute extreme. Imagine having a memory of 6 million years, right? You can't even think of what that would be like. So yeah, I would recommend his work. And then, of course, the classic master of the genre is Ian M. Banks, whose Culture series does the same thing. So yeah, you can take a look at you can try him as well. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So along the lines of your examples of that spider book
Yeah.
and the octopus book, do you know of examples, or are there good examples of books that address, things like racism from the perspective of some alternate evolutionary history where something like the Neanderthals didn't die out and we actually have two different human-like species? Are there books like that?
Well, I mean, the one that does that in the future is Time Machine. H.G. Wells' Time Machine in the future has these,
In the future, yeah.
Morlocks and the Eloi, right? And they're both like sort of descendants of human beings. But yeah, I mean,
But something more closely connected with what we know historically. I mean, not history, but evolutionarily.
so you're saying that like where you have like two different sets of like human.
Yeah. I mean, after all, that's the contingent fact of what evolution, right?
Yeah, no, I'm not sure I know of.
Nothing like that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there is, but I haven't read it. Yeah,
All right.
yeah.
Classification of what is science fiction and what is not, perhaps. So you're talking about things which are much ahead in time. But what about situations which are not so far ahead in time and you're trying to predict what the society society might be like? Would such things also come under science fiction or?
Well, I mean, it depends, right? I mean, 1984, A Brave New World, Fahrenheit 451, they're all science fiction novels that treat as science fiction. But I think it depends again on the method, right? So if you can trace an sort of like a extrapolatory line from where we are to where the novel is set, then yeah, I mean, it makes sense to call it science fiction. No. Yeah. Yeah. No, it doesn't. Yeah.
Well, are there any other questions?
Yeah.
We have maybe time for two more questions.
Yeah, I was wondering what your process is as to, I mean, I mean, do you usually start with a particular aspect of society that you wish to explore, and you use aspects of sci-fi or fantasy to sort of set the setting for this exploration? And like, when do you decide this much world building is enough, and this is when I want to focus more on the, I don't know, plot or the idea that you want?
Well, nothing quite so, I think detail. I begin with an image in my head and I know the ending of the story. So that's how it begins for me. So in my novel, the image was of a person in like a frozen chamber, preserved. And the ending, I knew what the ending was. And then I kind of build the story around that. And so the rest of it sort of comes iteratively in the process. When is there enough world building? You never know, right? Because again, you're doing it as you're doing it. So the world building and the writing for me is together. I don't start by building the world, and often as I'm writing, I learn more about the world. Like the characters teach you about the world as you're writing them. So it's an iterative process that goes back and forth between the two, at all times. Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay. So I had two questions. The first is, what if one were to do like Mark Fisher kind of criticism that, okay, we are just recycling the old tropes. The future is cancelled. Like there are no that kind of basically there's stagnation in the tropes. And the second question I would ask is, some of this tends to be naive, right? For example, the First Contact kind of novels. Most of them. The First Contact, I mean, with some alien species or something.
Yeah.
So, for example, this Stanislaw Lem's Solaris, which Tarkovsky's.
Yeah.
So even there, the point was just that how naive we are of thinking. That was one of his point to write that novel, right?
Yeah.
So, or even in Ministry of the Future, like although the scope of the book is wide, but most of the themes that he explores is discussed very naively. So these two questions that I.
No, are you saying the book is naive, or are you saying that the book, one of the points in the book is that human beings are naive?
No, so for example, in Ministry of the Future, even he himself regretted later about the central bankers and that kind of stuff that he wrote, or his discussion of eco-terrorism, etc. So so in that sense, it always tends to be like very naive, and then it connects to the first point of cultural stagnation, basically.
Well, I mean, I think it depends, like, book to book, right? So, I mean, I'm not a big fan of that book for the same reason that, that you brought up. Also, I think like it doesn't take the economics, I think, seriously enough. But yeah, like for example, Venomous Lumpsucker, somewhere there, I think it's actually like a very smart take on, what would happen when the extinction crisis clashes with our capitalist logic, right? And I think it's quite smart. So I think this is more a, like it depends upon the book. I think like with any genre of writing, you will have a lot of like naive writing, but you'll also have some good writing. On Fisher and like old tropes and ontology, I think a lot of science fiction is in that sense dealing with those kinds of tropes and repeating them in certain ways. But again, not all, right? So again, the example I'd give is some of that work on Ray Naylor's Mountain in the Sea or Tchaikovsky, where I don't think you're recycling, old tropes. In fact, there's a very interesting point towards the end of Tchaikovsky's novel, where actually the spider race behaves in a very different way than humans expect them to, because humans are deploying their own moral and ethical frameworks. And so they predict a certain kind of behavior, and it's totally different. So I think like, it's not just, I think, recycling tropes in that way.
Just one question. You mentioned Izuguro's Never Let Me Go. So it's a literary classic, and maybe the only science part is that mutation when human beings are being farmed for organs and all. But at the end of the day, the reader is, what takes away with him is the pathos of the character.
Yeah.
And I mean, hardly any science.
Yeah.
But if you were to give examples of work which, impress the reader as much by the scientific aspect as by the literary content. So any names, any suggestions on that?
The ones I've mentioned, I think so. Mountain in the Sea is like really fantastic writing as well. It's really good. And some of these books, Reynolds, like fantastic writing. Children of Time. Recently, a book came out called Toward Eternity by Anton Hur, who is better known as a translator of Korean fiction, which deals with issues around identity and time and so on. And I think if you're looking for an Ishiguro type experience, then this book might actually come closest to where like the science is there. It's there like as a layering, but actually it is really literary in its sensibilities, and its basic tone is literary and not so much the science fiction tone. Yeah.
Most of the books you mentioned have been either by Indian authors or by white. Other three common problems.
Yeah.
You have some recommendations that are
So Anton Hur is Korean, so that's like one. And then there is Afrofuturism, which is like a big thing right now. So Afrofuturism, Nedney Okafor, Tade Thompson, Rosewater trilogy. So you have like, I think African writers are it's also a big thing right now. And then of course there is Eastern European writers. So Stanislaw Lem's Solaris, which Tarkovsky went into a movie. In our science fiction book club in Delhi, we read Georgy Gospodinov's Time Shelter, which was a science fiction novel. So it's not strictly science fiction, but it can be read as one. So I think some of the examples would be that.
Thank you very much for these nicely interactive sessions we have, and really engaging in things. And now basically we are running out of time. So I request everybody to join me in appreciating the great lecture he has given to us. And hopefully many more to follow and things. And I welcome everybody to please have a tea, and you can continue the questioning him with the tea. Thank you. Thank you very much, bro. Very nice.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.